Hi, I'm Patricia Grabarek.
And I'm Katina Sawyer, and welcome to the Worker Being Podcast. Today, we are so lucky to be joined by Dolly Chugh. She is an award-winning professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. She teaches MBA courses in leadership and management, and she researches the psychology of good people, which is super interesting, and we're going to get more into that. Her first book, The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias, came out last year, and it's received rave praise from many people you may have heard of, like Adam Grant, Angela Duckworth, Liz Wiseman, Carol Dweck, and even Billie Jean King, amongst many others. And she's also given this amazing TED Talk. She gave it last year, which was named one of the 25 most popular TED Talks of 2018. And it currently has over 3.3 million views. So I hope that you add to those views after listening to this podcast. Thank you so much, Dolly, for being here with us.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me on your awesome podcast.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
To kick things off, would you describe a little bit about your book, The Person You Mean to Be, and what inspired you to write it?
Oh, sure. The title is a little bit of a giveaway in terms of how I see myself. I may study intellectually as a scholar these issues of unconscious bias or ethics. And intellectually, that's all fine and good, but the world is complicated, and I'm often navigating my own mistakes or confused by what's the right way to act in a certain situation, or blindsided by, not knowing that a certain word shouldn't be used or that was no longer appropriate. And so I feel often that the person I mean to be and the person I am on a day-to-day basis, that there's this gap there. So the science behind my book would suggest that that's, in fact, the reality for all of us, that there is no perfection in human behavior, and there's all sorts of stuff that happens outside of our awareness in our minds that we're not even tuned into, and those blind spots sometimes interfere with us being the person we mean to be. So I wrote this book. They say all research is me search. And in some ways, this book is my version of that. I wanted to curate science and stories that would help me have tools and strategies to do better in the world, and to make them available to a general audience, not just to people who have access to scholarly journals or interest in reading those kinds of pieces.
We love that. That's very much aligned, as you know, with our mission to make sure people can access this kind of information, and research in an accessible way. And it sounds like that's exactly where you were coming from too.
Yeah.
And with everything you just said, so it kind of leads to our next thought is around the why behind it. So we understand that, there isn't a perfect situation for a person, right? You're continuously growing. Why do you think it's important for people to commit to continuously improve who they are, especially in terms of inclusivity?
Yeah. Well, it really stems from how we often think about inclusion, in anything related to sort of the stuff we put in the bucket of being a good person. We think of that stuff a little differently. Like, if you wanted to start a podcast, you wouldn't assume that you should just know how to do a podcast, that you should know how to do the recording and how to get the word out and how to craft the questions. And you wouldn't assume that would just be a known thing. You would ask around, you would read, you would experiment, you'd make mistakes, you'd get better. And you would, as a podcast creator, your skills would continue to grow throughout the life of your podcast. But somehow when it comes to issues that we put in that bucket of being a good person, like inclusion or diversity, we assume that we should just know how to do it. That's just that you're a good person or you're not, or you were raised a certain way or you weren't. And we put ourselves on this pretty thin ledge where it's either you're a good person or you're a bad person. And the reason the ledge is so thin is that we're defining good person as someone who doesn't make mistakes, someone who doesn't have blind spots. And the research of the last 50 years in social psychology and cognitive psychology tells us that that's just scientifically wrong, that everyone has blind spots, that 90+ % of our mental functioning takes place outside of our awareness. It's why you can drive home listening to this podcast after a busy day at work and get home and not even remember the drive home, that you were on autopilot, your mind was busy, it was listening, it was processing your day, and you were able to navigate turns and red lights and pedestrians and all sorts of things without having to consciously engage in that work, because so much of the mind's work happens outside of our awareness. And so if we accept what is scientifically true, that a lot of the mind's work happens outside of awareness, and therefore it's possible that there are things that we are saying or doing or processing that we're not even realizing. And if we accept that, therefore that means that as good people, we might sometimes still make mistakes, then that thin ledge we've put ourselves on is a really dangerous, dangerous place, because it means we can easily fall off, and we're not willing to accept that. In the same way that we're willing to accept that I don't necessarily know how to do a podcast without getting better at it, we don't accept that becoming a good person and being a good person is a set of skills I'm going to continually have to practice, improve, and learn from mistakes about, in the same way. So I think it's important that we continually work on improving these skills, because if we sit in a commitment to I am a good person, period, and we're very wedded to that identity, it actually gets in the way of us being better people. We have to let go of that good person, our view of ourselves as good people, in order to become better people.
Yeah, and I love that. I think that that's really important to keep in mind with regard to, even teaching and talking with business professionals or consulting or coaching. A lot of the feedback that I've gotten as someone who teaches about diversity and inclusion in organizations is, why would you want to go talk to an audience of business professionals who probably don't see this as very important to their job? They don't care, or maybe they're not too into this conversation. And I'm always like, those are the people I'd love to talk to. Like, let's get engaged in a conversation with people that actually have a lot of room to grow and improve, but who are open-minded to making those changes. It's almost like people expect or have this expectation of themselves and others that you're just going to be great at this, and if you're not great at it, you're kind of a lost cause. So I really love this idea. I know you talk about growth mindset in the book as well. This idea of continuously growing.
Yeah.
As people are on that journey, what are some of the challenges that they face in being more inclusive? What are some of the biggest things that you see in the research or in your experience being roadblocks for people, and how do they tend to overcome those things? Because it's not easy.
No, it's not. No, absolutely. Well, I think, and I'm so glad you brought up the growth mindset research by Carol Dweck and her colleagues. I think that is the biggest obstacle, is that we bring a fixed mindset, one in which we don't assume ourselves to be works in progress. We assume that whatever level we're at is the level we're going to be at, and that effort won't change that, feedback won't change that. And some of us think we're like super woke and we've already figured this out, and other of us think, like you said, it's just not something that we're deeply engaged in. And as a result, what we know from that mindset research is that when we do make a mistake, like the studies on mindset have shown that, let's say someone's doing math problems and they're in a fixed mindset, they don't view that as a skill that's going to improve, and they make a mistake, brain activity actually goes down when the mistake is pointed out. Like, we actually withdraw at exactly the moment where there's learning possibilities. Whereas when we're in a growth mindset, when we do view ourselves as a work in progress and we make a mistake, our brain activity goes up. We actually get extra attentive and focused, because it makes sense. It's like, well, I might as well, there's something to be learned here that will help me. And there's no point in learning if I don't think I can change. But if I think I can change, then I guess it's worth the brain waves. And so I think just sort of changing how we view ourselves is a huge challenge, and it really contradicts all the messages we get from the world around us in this cancel culture and call out culture. We often, I think, don't feel we have that room to see ourselves as a work in progress, but I think for most of us who aren't, living in the public eye on a daily basis, we have more room than we think. We just need to give ourselves that room.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when you think about your development from youth, into adulthood, your perspectives on everything changes dramatically, right? And then all of a sudden it's like we feel like, okay, now we're adults and now we're stable, but that's
No.
not true. People continue to develop and change over time. You're not the same person at 40 as you were at 30 and at 60 as you were at 20. Like there's a lot of growth and development. So I think it's like you were saying, that awareness, that mindset that really comes into play here to make sure that people are actively continuing to grow and not just letting themselves go along for the ride.
Right. And and I see it in myself, like, the any number of like embarrassing things I've done, mistakes I've made. There was a student I was mentoring, and a very young person, and she was really good at math and science, and I was speaking to one of her teachers, and the teacher was kind of gushing about her, and I was gushing about it. We were all gushing, and it was one of those moments where like two people sort of talk at the same time, but they're saying the same thing. So it's like kind of synchronous. And we're both saying someday she would be an amazing. And the teacher said doctor, because we were speaking about math and science. And I said nurse in that moment. And this is, I have huge respect for nurses, but I think if there's someone who you think is well suited for a healthcare profession, it seems like you should consider both the doctor and nurse career path. And somehow my mind, in all those years I had been mentoring her, had never considered doctor for her. Like I had always been encouraging her to consider nursing. And so, moments like that, it's like, the question is, when that moment became apparent, when the teacher's words and my words collided in midair, I was mortified. I mean, mortified. And then the question is, what do I do in that moment? What do I do with that mistake? And it took some like internal wrestling with my own ego to acknowledge sort of the learning I had to do, that somehow, I don't know if it's because she was female or Hispanic or what it was, but I just had a massive, massive blind spot to the possibilities of her as a doctor.
Well, it also seems like, I think that's an awesome example, because those are the kinds of things that, sort of happen where it's not like you're intending to do anything negative towards this person. In fact, you were really thinking about their positive characteristics and how that might play out into a positive future for them. But there's some limitation to the way that our brain's training shapes the way that we react and respond to other people that we may not even be aware of, even if we're well-intentioned. Exactly. Yeah. And so I love that example. And I think that, it speaks to this broader issue as well of being able to admit that you make mistakes. Like the fact that you talk about that example in the book, and you also are willing to say, hey, here's where I've messed up. Here's how I'm trying to get better, helps to role model for people that they don't have to say nothing. I think, and you might find this too in classes, when I teach about these topics, I find that students are so unwilling to even talk about them sometimes because they're so worried of saying the wrong thing. And there's good reason sometimes to be worried about it, because if you do say the wrong thing, people almost have gotten into this. You talked about like cancel culture, like people almost gotten into this like one-upmanship about like, hey, I'm more woke than you. No, I'm more woke than you. And in a way, it's helpful that people are aware, but it also limits learning, I think, for people who might need to learn more, because it sort of shuts down the conversation and makes it about shame as opposed to about like positive emotions and feeling like I can do this, I can tackle
I think
this.
that's right. I think that's right. Yeah. The making your learning visible is so powerful in everything in life, and definitely in any topic that evokes shame. And it's something that I'm surprised at how much easier it's become. Like when I first started publicly talking about my own mistakes, I was really terrified. I would like be sweating while I would share these things in front of a class or an audience. And what I've noticed is the world didn't stop spinning. Like people weren't like, oh, she has a blind spot. It was like the world knew I had blind spots. Like everybody knew but me, and the same is true that we know about everyone else's blind spots. They're the ones still figuring it out. And so then I think the muscle memory sort of built of like, oh, this is this is part of doing the work, is modeling taking ownership.
Yeah. I mean, it's critical. I love everything that you're saying about that, because we do need to take ownership for it. We need to be aware of it. And I think everybody surrounding people that maybe make mistakes, we need to be more supportive than maybe our culture currently has us feeling we should be.
Yeah.
So
You know,
I agree
I'll
with
just
all of
throw
that.
in one little nuance on that, which is I talk a little bit in the book about the difference between heat and light when you're trying to make change, particularly social change. And light is where you meet people where they are and consider their comfort and don't push too hard. And heat is where sort of the cancel culture or protests, or where you don't take the comfort of the people you're trying to change into account. And I think as educators, we certainly drawn towards light, and my personality is more light. That said, what I learned in doing my research for the book was that in social movements that have been most effective, both heat and light have been employed in a balanced way. So the civil rights movement, for example, had a radical flank and a moderate flank. Social movements that have relied heavily on heat or heavily on light have not been as effective. And I think, I haven't read this analysis, but my personal analysis of that is that heat changes systems, not necessarily attitudes, but systems, whereas light changes attitudes. So heat changes kind of the macro level stuff, and light changes the individuals, or the micro level. And that's my theory, as yet unpublished and untested theory by Dolly Chugh of why both heat and light are essential. So I like light myself, and my takeaway from doing the work around this book is that I need to do more to amplify people willing to bring the heat.
Yeah. And I think that's a great way of talking about it, because, this heat and light concept is really important, because some people are not as drawn to, or feel as compelled to, or feel like they're best suited
Right.
for either one of those roles, right? So you can kind of pick where you want to focus your time and energy, or maybe you want to do both. But I think that it's really crucial that, regardless of whether you're involved in heat or light, that you're also not putting the onus on people who are actively, at the receiving end of the discrimination or negative treatment, to have responsibility to bring that heat or to bring that light. So I think the big thing is that, taking these things as teachable moments, and you can kind of, pick what your mode of teaching is, but thinking about, how do you bring a message? What is the message? And how can you help to maybe relieve some of the tension and pressure that's on individuals who are also like emotionally dealing with the fact that they're on the receiving end of negativity. So, I think that it's complicated, as you discuss in the book, but I really like how you're using these concepts to bring this to light for people. Too light. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance there in terms of how you handle the individual. I do really appreciate the idea of the light and handling people who maybe are not making mistakes intentionally, versus heat from a bigger perspective. I think that makes a lot of sense, because we all know the person that shuts down if they make a mistake and maybe didn't mean to do it, but then get a lot of negativity thrown back at them because of it, that they never then change and learn. And I think we don't want to do that to individuals that possibly were open at one point and then shut down because of the way they were responded to. But to Katina's point, obviously it needs to be coming from people that maybe aren't on the brunt end of that person's comment or whatever it is on Twitter or wherever we find these things.
There's space for all of us in this work.
Yeah. So kind of on that note, in terms of societal shifts or impacts on individuals who are doing these behaviors or receiving these kinds of behaviors, what do you hope are the outcomes associated with driving inclusivity, sort of the end game of writing the book? What do you hope to influence from a attitudinal or health related or wellness related perspective within society or within people?
Yeah. Well, I've been talking about being goodish instead of good. And the idea with being goodish is that, as we talked about a few minutes ago, that we're viewing ourselves as learners in this space. And every time we think about moments where we've learned something, we usually speak about it with a sort of zest and an excitement about this thing we've learned, whatever the thing is. And I would like us to be thinking about issues like diversity and inclusion with that kind of zest. And I realize, I don't say that casually, I realize how much painful history in the past and in the present, current events there is. And yet at the same time, I think we will all be happier and healthier if we can approach this as a learnable skill, as goodish people trying to do better. And we also know that bias has real negative health outcomes on the people targeted. And it's particularly sort of damaging when it's unclear or ambiguous if a bias is actually in play. That when people are left to guess about ambiguous or unconscious bias and whether or not it affected a behavior directed towards them, that creates elevated heart rate and all sorts of other health outcomes that are really negative. So I think the more we can do to name and notice things that aren't visible, the more we can do to contribute to it. We can't always make the harm go away, but we can perhaps make some of the ambiguity go away by naming and noticing it. So I'd love to see us all trying to be goodish rather than good, and to name and notice what we see around us.
I love that, goodish. It just encourages that continuous improvement versus that static place where we're just good or bad and not on the way.
That's right.
To
it's
good.
A higher standard. Goodish is better than good.
Love it.
So we have a final fun question for you before we wrap up here. So we'd like to ask all of our interviewees something fun at the end. So we'd love to know about your perfect afternoon. If you were able to craft your perfect afternoon, what would you do and where would you go?
My perfect afternoon would be with my my husband and my kids, exploring something new, a new experience, a new place, a new movie, something where we're all sort of new to something at the same time. And in this magically constructed perfect afternoon, my two teenagers would not be fighting. They wouldn't have headphones in. They wouldn't have screens out. We would all just be physically and mentally and emotionally present together and at our best. And then it would be followed by time by myself reading, which is my favorite. I think my favorite activity of all is just, I love reading.
That's
nice.
awesome.
So
that sounds like a great afternoon.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you want our listeners to know about where to find your work or the book, or anything else you want to tell them to wrap things up?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, the book is called The Person You Mean to Be: How Good People Fight Bias. And it's written for general audiences, filled with stories, sprinkled with science. I really would love for as many people as possible to access the tools and strategies. So you can find it wherever you buy books, whether it's at a chain bookstore, an independent bookstore, or Amazon type bookstore. And if you do read it, I encourage people to post honest reviews. I appreciate all reviews. I read every single one, and they do help more readers find the book, because the more reviews there are, the better the algorithm treats the book.
Awesome. Well, we hope that you all go find the book. We love it. It's a great book, a great tool to use in your workplaces. And it has just been awesome having you here with us, Dolly. So thank you so much again.
This was so much fun. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Dolly Chugh for joining us today. It was so great to hear her perspective and her research. You can find more information about Dolly at her website, which is Dolly Chugh, DOLLYCHUGH.com. We'll also link to it in the show notes, plus a link to her book. And if you would love to talk to us about this, like we're really excited about her work, so if we would love to hear from you too, you can find us at workerbeing.com. You can email us at workerbeing@gmail.com, or you can find us on social media at workerbeing. Thanks. The Worker Being podcast is hosted by us, Patricia Grabarek
and Katina Sawyer, and produced by Allie Johnson.